Hello, High Rock. Welcome to our daily devotional. We're continuing with our walk through the Gospel of Mark in tandem with our Sunday sermon series. And today we are in Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. And Michael, I'm going to ask you to read that for us.
All right. Hear the word of the Lord. As evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's cross to the other side of the lake." So they took Jesus in the boat and started out, leaving the crowds behind, although other boats followed. But soon a fierce storm came up. High waves were breaking into the boat, and it began to fill with water. Jesus was sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. The disciples woke him up, shouting, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?" When Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Silence, be still." Suddenly the wind stopped, and there was a great calm. Then he asked them, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" The disciples were absolutely terrified. "Who is this man?" they asked each other. "Even the wind and waves obey him." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Well, immediately reminded here that, as we've said often in these devotionals, that the most common, most frequent command in all of the scriptures is do not fear. Don't be afraid. Fear not. However you want to phrase it, this command to not fear, but instead to trust in God is the most common command. It's even when the angels come to announce Christmas to the shepherds, they say, fear not. And fear is riddled all through this passage from all different kinds of sources. But one of the things here is, the Sea of Galilee is a pretty big lake, actually. If you've been to Lake Winnipesaukee, they're almost exactly the same size, the Sea of Galilee and Lake Winnipesaukee. But unlike Winnipesaukee, Sea of Galilee is subject to some really powerful storms. If you travel there and you're on one of the beaches, you'll see these warnings by where the cars park about the storms that can come and cars get swamped and things like that. And the people of Israel were a desert people. They weren't seafarers. And so other than this, these fishermen, they pretty much avoided deep water. And in their worldview, deep water was a place of chaos, a place of evil. Even in the Sumerian mythos, there's this god Tiamat, who's this great multi-headed dragon whose home is the deep sea, comes out of the chaos of the sea. And when this image is kind of transposed into the book of Revelation, where this great beast comes out of the sea. It's the place of evil and chaos. And so these fishermen who fear this evil, and they're in the midst of this deep water, and Jesus is in the boat, but he's sleeping. He's actually got his head down. He's resting. He's calm. He's happy. And they wake him up and they're afraid. And I love what he says here in verse 40. He asked them, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And of course, even in response to this, this statement of "don't be afraid," they're even more afraid. They're actually says they're absolutely terrified because now they're afraid of Jesus. Because who is this person? And there's a verse I pulled up out of Psalm 107, and it gives an idea of maybe what they were thinking at this moment. Like they realize Jesus is pretty special, but they're not quite getting how special he is. And this realization is starting to dawn on them, I believe. And that fills them with even more fear. Because here's Psalm 107, verse 29. It says that God made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were silenced. So in that moment, they're really afraid because they're starting to realize that there's something incredible going on here that's beyond their understanding, beyond their experience. Kind of the world behind this world is breaking through. And I think when we experience those kinds of things, it does fill us with fear. But Michael, I'm wondering what you experience here in this passage, and maybe what is it that, in fact, I think a great question for us all to consider today for this devotional is the question that Jesus asks in verse 40. Like in the storms of our life, when we experience storms in our life, when we experience the presence of evil and bad things in our life, the things that we think are going to take away our life or the joys of our life or the things that matter most to us, Jesus is not afraid of these things. And I think he speaks to us this same statement. Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? And it's not a judgment, right? I mean, well, it is a judgment in a certain sense. It's not meant to be condemning, but it's a statement of almost pity. I don't. I know that word has a very negative connotation sometimes, but I think Jesus is somewhat exasperated, but also pitying them that they aren't able to get past this fear because they don't yet truly understand who Jesus is and what he's able to do for them. Anyway, Michael, how do you feel about this passage, and how do you feel about the fear that they're experiencing?
Yeah, I think that is the verse that stands out to me. Um, the disciples were absolutely terrified. Why are you afraid? And I just think about like it is surprising, like, but I can't put myself in, like if I was in there, I would also be terrified. Um, but I would think that I was terrified like once the waves and the wind have dissipated, like, oh, that's then I'm no longer afraid. But even in my own life, when there's, metaphorically like storms, when they dissipate, it's like when the next one comes or something else happens, I still have that same fear. It's hard to know what to do in that space, because the answer would be like, how, like, do not fear. Okay, like, how do I not fear? Have faith. Oh well, we've established that I don't have faith, so that doesn't really help me. Um, it just feels like fear can like invade the space that faith is meant to inhabit, um, and I think it is really hard once you've kind of lost faith to kind of drive that fear out. And it makes me think of if I was as I was reflecting on this passage, it made my mind jump to Ephesians 6, where it talks about the armor of God and how the faith is the shield, right, that
Mm-hmm.
protects us, that guards us from the fiery darts of the devil, which you could kind of say like the fear that the devil just keeps throwing at the things we're afraid of. um, but as I understand, maybe you can like even elaborate on this, is that like a shield is not just a protective weapon, but in that context, it also would have been kind of an offensive weapon as well in the way that it was utilized. And I don't often think about how like yes, faith or a shield is meant to guard me, but a shield can also be the thing that drives or pushes against the very thing that's trying to like put me down. And when I think about it in that way, it's like all I can do is that like knowing that God has given me this shield, and then ask him like or trust that I will be able to use it. Um, and that's kind of where I sit now, is like I feel like I have this shield of faith. It's not very big, but it's protecting me from some things, and I guess I'm hoping and praying that I could grow it a little bit more by just yeah. I'm still in process around that. It's a big question.
Well, the shield is kind of interesting too, because in the Greek and Roman context that Paul was often writing into, the shield is not just something that you use as an individual, but is used in a coordinated fashion with a group. You think about stories like the 300 Spartans who defended against the Persian invasion. Those hoplites practiced how to lock their shields into place to form a barrier that where they were stronger together than they could possibly be alone. And so when I see that image of the shield, I like to think of that, or the way that the Romans would create these turtles and this turtle formation where they'd lock shield to shield and be able to rely on each other's strength, that they'd be covering each other's weaknesses. So that's a kind of interesting image to me. But I guess what I think about with fear is, telling someone to not be afraid is almost like telling them to not think of pink elephants, right? And as soon as you say that, of course, you can't help but think of pink elephants, right? It's very difficult to stop thinking of something, to just create a blank space. Instead, I think what we have to do generally is to think of something else. And if we think of something else, then we can stop thinking of the thing that we're fixating on. And in the case, if it's fear versus faith, then maybe when we're in situations where we're afraid, that's the time to be thinking about why we don't need to be afraid. Like in this case, Jesus saying like, kind of their fear is like figuring out starting to figure out who Jesus really is. But I think one thing that's really powerful is, as individuals, but I think especially as communities, to have like in Thanksgiving or other places, to have regular times in our lives where we remember the ways that God has come through for us in difficult times. And the more that we can do that, the more we can be fluent in the language of remembering God's faithfulness, then God's faithfulness can create in us faith. And that faith can replace the fear that we are tempted to experience in that moment. I know that's the case for me in a lot of situations where I'm afraid. What I really need to do is kind of get some distance from the thing that I'm afraid of sometimes, just so that I can get into a different space and begin to remember the ways that God has been faithful to me. But all that said, it's interesting before we came on to do this recording, you were mentioning about how they're afraid of Jesus, and I do have an experience like that as well. Where one time when I was visiting colleges, I was transferring from Carnegie Mellon to go to a Christian college. I wanted to get a Christian education because I was a new believer, and I remember I was up at Houghton College and I was attending a chapel that evening where they were having a healing prayer service. And I remember as I was walking up to the door to enter into the chapel, as I reached out to the door, I was overcome with this real sense of dread. And the best way I can describe it was that in that moment, the realization really washed over me. The realization that the step that I was taking, not just into that chapel, but into this next phase of life where I was really seeking to, you know, grow in God in much more powerful ways by attending a Christian college, getting a Christian education, all these things. I was suddenly overcome with fear of what might God do with my life? What might God ask me to do? The stories of the heroes of our faith these are women and men who were asked to do incredible things. Of course, not without support, but they often had to go into, read the heroes of the faith in the book of Hebrews. It even says that many of them didn't even receive in this life the things that they were promised. They had to wait with us to receive them all together when Christ returns. And so I just was overcome with this sense of dread. And I guess the thing that made me continue going forward was the one thing that I was more afraid of than actually taking that step was I was more afraid of not taking that step. Like once having seen, once having tasted, once having understood what God is offering to me, as scary as that might be, to me it was even scarier to say no, to turn away from it, because at least there's hope on the other side of that door. Not going through the door just leaves me with questions and regret. Anyway, Michael, I'm wondering if you have any other thoughts about what you're afraid of, what helps you with fear, and if you close us in prayer after that.
Yeah, what you just said actually really kind of sparked something in me of like that question, like why the disciples were afraid. And it's like, because they're asking, who is this man? And in that I hear like, oh, I thought I was just following some rabbi who like, or some Messiah who's going to get me things that I want. But no, this is like a totally different person. And I've already gotten into the boat and said I would follow this guy. Like, what have I gotten myself into? Who is this man? Like, what have I committed to? And I think that is often like my biggest fear of like, all right, if this is true, like that's kind of scary. Like what Jesus actually calls us into, the faith that he is like he models and lives, like his life, death, and resurrection is like, wait, the ending of that is not the most ideal. It's not how I would write the story.
That sparked one final thing. I think someone said to me once that part of the difficulty of faith is that we all want to write our own story, but the problem with that is that we would all write very boring stories. We would eliminate the conflicts. We would eliminate the downsides. We would make them pretty peaceful and uneventful in a lot of ways. And those are boring stories. God is writing a much more active story that involves life and death and loss and redemption and restoration and all these things that in the end are much more filled with joy, but means that we also have to go through some really hard things along the same way. And I think that can often fill us with a sense of fear that we're taking part in a story that we see the way that God has written it out in the Gospels, and we see the life of Jesus. And as you say, I wouldn't write the story that way, but it's a better story. And that's the invitation that we have, is to enter into this story that's better than the one we would have written for ourselves. Well, that was my final thought.
Yeah. Well, let me pray. Lord, thank you so much for your word. Thank you for this question. Thank you for the story that you've written. And I pray that we would have the courage to step into this story, into this beautiful story of life that comes from death. And I pray that we would all have the faith to grow into living that story. So your name I pray, Jesus, and ask these things. Amen.
Amen. In the end there, I thought you were going to say that Jesus invites us to get into the boat.
That would have been good.
Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed today, and everyone, and thanks for being with us, and I hope that you'll get back into the boat with us again tomorrow. See you then.